Why do Republicans and conservatives seem to always be at the losing end of history? We're on a current upswell of a certain sense with the Republicans and conservatives. Uh, However, if they fail to break form, if they follow their historical patterns, we can expect failure again in the near future. Now, get a grasp on what I mean by failure and what's entailed in it, we do need to kind of separate the idea of the Republican Party and conservatism from each other for a little bit, because although the two parallel each other a lot and sometimes are heavily intertwined, clearly not every Republican is a conservative. So let's talk a little bit about Republicanism, the idea of the Republican Party. So if we look at political parties in the United States prior to the formation of the Republican Party, uh, a really good period to look at is the, the period of the Whig Party, American Whig Party, and its contest with the Democratic Party. Now, if you looked at the two parties at the time, and if you asked major members and probably people down even to the voting level, the people who would vote primarily Democrat or Whig, and you asked them what are the party principles of these parties, they could probably tell you fairly succinctly. Now, neither party had a true solid philosophy that could be boiled down to like a single line or statement, but they could boil them down to a handful of statements, and they wouldn't vary far from them. So these were parties that had principles, honest to goodness belief systems that they followed. And if you look, especially looking at the Whig Party, it would be hard for most Americans to wrap their brain around these ideas. But they were definable, and the party followed them. In fact, the party followed them so well, they followed them to their ultimate destruction. The Whigs, as a party, ultimately failed because they stuck to their principles to the bitter end, to when the populace had moved far beyond what the Whigs were standing for. Now, not necessarily good for survival, but it is good for consistency. Now, one of the big problems that comes with the formation of the Republican Party is the Republican Party wasn't interested in principles per se like its predecessors were. The Republican Party founded on the general idea of who were all the people disenfranchised from the Democratic Party, i.e., the people who weren't being represented by Democrats. So they created the big tent approach, where essentially, if the Democratic Party didn't represent you, the Republicans would create a plank that said, we represent you. So, in fact, it was a coalition party. Not built around principles, but built around the idea of if we get enough of us, we can consistently beat or at least match Democratic political prowess. Now, this Republican idea would end up having contagion into the Democratic Party, of course, too, because at that point, the Democratic Party has to say, well, gee, if they can gobble up every constituency that we are ignoring, now we have to start looking for other ignored constituencies. And so this created this ever revolving effect of whenever a new issue appeared, well, obviously in the new issue, there's always going to be people for and against. And one party would make the race to grab one side of the argument and the other party would grab the other, uh, creating a system of never-ending permanent polarization. If you've ever seen, there's the movie, Eddie Murphy movie called The Distinguished Gentleman. I highly recommend it. It may not be outrageously funny as it might have been when it was first released, but it's loaded with ridiculous amounts of political truths. Eddie Murphy plays a congressman who gets elected by having the same name as the incumbent congressman who just died. So the people have no idea who he is. They just vote for the name they recognize, and he ends up coming into Congress. And he's a total political neophyte, has no idea how anything works. And there are a lot of sequences that really ring true. Whereas a point where one of the lobbyists is sitting with him is actually a lawyer who represents lobbyists. And so he would say something to the effect of, so, where do you stand on corn subsidies? And, so the Eddie Murphy would say, well, gee, I'm not really sure, because he had no idea really what the issues were. And the guy says, well, if you're for them, I can hook you up with these guys over here, this particular lobby that will give you money for being for the corn subsidies. Now, if you're against them, I can get you these guys over here who will pay you money to be against the corn subsidies. And he ends up going down a long list very similar to this. And it's not, I mean, obviously it's comical, but it's not terribly far from the truth either. The idea of captured constituencies. So this Republican Party, because it's a big tent organization, when the progressive movement started rampaging across the country to lay in its inevitable destruction that it did, the Republican Party had no immunity to it. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. The party was willing to take him on because it had no set of principles that said, oh, well, what's this progressivism about? Well, let's weigh it against our principles. Well, we don't have principles. Okay, well, are we for or against this? Which side are we grabbing? And ultimately, progressivism forms initially in the Republican Party and then ends up taking over the Democratic Party. However, there's a residual of lesser progressives in the Republican Party. And the lesser progressives believe literally everything a greater progressive does. Yeah, that there's virtually no thing that government shouldn't be in charge of, that it shouldn't manage or control, because if you put a group of smart people at the top of a centralized structure, they're going to do a great job ultimately. The only difference between greater and lesser progressives is the lesser progressives go, oh, no, 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 you're going too fast. Yeah, we should do everything you want to do, but at a much slower pace. We need to see how it impacts things, and we don't want to upset people by having too much change too quickly. So basically, doing the wrong thing slowly also becomes a bit of a conservative value, because rapid change isn't conservative, but if we're slowing it down, at least that's a little conservative, isn't it? So the Republican Party uh, ends up taking a bit of a drubbing because of the economic situation of the Depression. And they never fully recover from it. And actually, there is a 1-2 punch involved here where leading into World War II, the Republican Party was the anti-war party. Recall it was the Democrats who engineered the U.S. entry into World War One, and FDR, absolutely, regardless of what any historian said, desperately wanted the United States in on World War II, and was maneuvering the United States to that position as World War II was building up. Roosevelt was heavily involved in pushing us in that direction. And the Republicans were trying to stand against this kind of movement. They were the moving force behind the Neutrality Acts. And once the attack on Pearl Harbor came about, this idea that if you were in any way a pacifist, if you weren't aggressively pro-war, you were some kind of pansy. And this was something that absolutely destroyed the morale and spirit of the Republican Party. So the combination of the Depression and Democratic policies attempting to alter the course of the Depression and the impact of World War II on pacifism. So Republicans following the war became overwhelmingly lesser progressives. They didn't talk about getting rid of any of FDR's policies. They just talked about slow rolling everything that was currently in progress. And they no longer were as adamant about being anti-war. They may oppose a war as it approached, but they would embrace it heavily once it was there. And once we had the rise of the military-industrial complex following World War II, Republicans embraced this as well. Some of this, and that goes, the embrace of the industrial complex goes across both party lines, because both sides were looking to move federal spending into their areas. But it was a far move away from where Republican ideals started at. And the Republicans are able to make these rapid changes from, at one point, if you look back towards the beginning of the Republican Party was not particularly pro-gun. They were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into the because essentially the NRA was formed primarily from old retired Union officers who had a major goal of essentially making it so that militias weren't as effective as they were before. If you look at the initial part of the war, militias were a little bit too effective, especially if you look at the southern side of things. Republicans would be dragged kicking and screaming into the somewhat pro-gun camp due to anti-gun laws being used against their freed black constituents in the South. However, their view of guns would remain tepid, probably up until 70s, and definitely finally breaking out into pure Second Amendment support in the 90s. But we see an endless malleability to the Republicans because they don't have a set of principles. They started out anti-war. They started out having moderate views on the use of government in order to affect change. And they very quickly changed into whatever needed to be at the time in terms of gobbling up new bits of the electorate that had come up with ideas that weren't being held by either party yet. And typically the Democrats would move first, grab their constituency, and then the Republicans would follow by grabbing the anti-constituency to whatever the new idea came up. So if you look at the Republicans, they endlessly claim to be the party of small government, yet there's little evidence of them being ever able to slow down spending and taxing to the point where they actually shrink government. Uh, some of the worst deficits have come under Republican administrations. Uh, so now let's kind of dig back to the term conservative. Um, you'll hear a term, probably it is not as frequently used anymore, but the concept is called a paleocon. A paleoconservative, old conservative, essentially is somebody who embraced a set of conservative values that tend to predate FDR. And the paleocons are pacifists. They do not believe in war. They do believe in defense to a certain extent, but they're very wary of the military industrial complex. Uh, they're very much moderates on what government should be doing. In fact, they have a lot of crossover with libertarians. There are areas where the paleocons don't agree with libertarians, where the paleocons tend to have more of a religious bent, where they want to incorporate their belief system into the government. And then your typical run-of-the-mill conservative is probably what most people kind of the caricature of what the politician who talks endlessly about smaller government, etc., etc. But okay, so here's where some of the problems come into with conservatism. So if you're mixing with people who are essentially lesser progressives, and you're also mixing with people who have essentially abandoned the idea of pacifism at all, how do you really shrink government? And you run into a problem where you have to answer the question is, what is it that government should be doing? Now, if you throw this question at different sections of the Republican Party, you're going to end up getting completely different answers. Oh, you might get a little bit of agreement here and there where, oh yeah, the Department of Education might need to go. But the question comes, and I'll give you a really good example of where rhetoric and action fail each other. So the Affordable Care Act got passed during the Obama administration, and then when the Republicans held Congress, they repeatedly voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, as soon as there was a Republican president, even though Congress was pretty much the same and the Republicans had a majority, all of a sudden they couldn't pass a repeal to the Affordable Care Act because they didn't actually believe it, because there were a lot of Republicans posing as conservatives who are actually lesser progressives. So they had to show their true colors, lest something they actually believe in get repealed. So you'll hear conservatives say, well, yeah, we're 100% pro-Constitution. We're all there for it. So as a pro-Constitution Republican, a pro-Constitution conservative, ask them about the section of the Constitution that deals with Congress and the Army. Because the Constitution says there should be no standing army. Not those exact words, but it specifically says that the army can only be raised in times of war and can be only raised for a maximum of 2 years. And if you look at the similar clause next to it dealing with the Navy, it says Congress is authorized to build and maintain a Navy. So the two clauses were specifically written with the intent that, yes, there's a standing Navy, but there's no standing Army. Yet today we have a standing Army. How many conservatives who are pro-Constitution will back up and say, hey, yeah, the way we're doing the Army isn't constitutional. We should either pass an amendment to rewrite that to back modern reality, or we should follow the Constitution the way it's written. And that's something you won't hear out of any of them. So how can you be a principled conservative if you believe in the Constitution except where it becomes really horribly inconvenient? And that's not even a, well, that's just, that's the way they thought about it then, and now we think about it, the wording, we don't understand the word. No, the wording is clear as day, and it's not some weird thing where, the Supreme Court read it wrong one time and now we're kind of stuck with it. No, it doesn't say that. It's very clear what's going on there. Now, one of the problems we've seen with the conservative and Republican movements was the whole neocon fiasco. Neocons were essentially people who believed in, call it an American system. They weren't constitutional in nature. They just kind of looked at America as it is, saying, it seems to work pretty good. We're all pro-American. And we want to bring this American system to the rest of the world. Neocons originally started out in the Democratic Party in the 60s, and they slowly migrated over to the Republican Party and dominated it in the 90s. In fact, it was neocon policy which drove our war in Iraq to the second time. Their grand idea of toppling Iraq, placing a Western-style democracy there, and it essentially transforming the entire region into parallel copies of the American system that the neocons so loved. Yeah. Now, to understand neocons are not constitutionalists unless it benefits them. They look at the American establishment as it is, the system as it's being, as it actually functions, not its ideal. And they say, it's working great, this is it. And this is what they try to bring forward. And a lot of conservatives ended up working directly with these neocons because they were pro-military, pro-war, and we end up having a problem, because if we need a big military industrial complex, well, then we need to be doing things all over the world, and you never really can get small government when you have a military that's cost at least 10 times more than our nearest adversary. And none of this is constitutional. Having bases overseas, all over the place, in places where we have permanent treaties and in places where we barely have working agreements. We are clandestinely fighting wars all over the planet, secret sites that probably some people in the highest level of the executive branch don't even realize are there, and hardly a word out of our Constitution-loving conservatives. And the problem is, because they've never had a true set of principles, they're always malleable. So let's look how this plays out. So if you were to compare a conservative to a libertarian, well, a conservative in 1938 would have been anti-war. So would have a libertarian. However, following World War II, most conservatives become pro-war. prior to World War II, libertarians would have been very skeptical of the idea of a large military, and probably having numerous proposals for how to make it smaller, how to make it less centralized, how to disperse it, how to function without a standing army even. Whereas conservatives can never reach this position, and they are fully embracing a large military, an industrial complex pretty much fed by tax money to support this military and military activities all over the world. A libertarian has always been non-interventionalist, whereas conservatives can flip on a dime as to whether they're interventionalist or not on any particular issue. Most often, they become highly interventionalist when a Republican is the president, and they find their anti-interventionalist credentials when there's a Democrat in office. They can always critique a Democrat's war, but have a hard time not critiquing a Republican's war. Now, a libertarian would have pretty much been consistent on saying things like FBI and CIA and NSA are things that should not exist, or at least not anything remotely in the form they are now. However, conservatives will say, oh, well, yeah, we were against those before, but now we're for having them run only by good people. You know, if we get the right people in charge of these organizations, they will fulfill the functions that we want them to fulfill. Some other areas where Republicans lost their way, Republicans would have been at least skeptical of the creation of the Federal Reserve. However, very few of them, you know, with a very limited extent of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, even questions the idea of the Federal Reserve. In fact, it's all you can do to even get them to audit the Federal Reserve. We can see some of the confusion dealing with being a conservative, whereas if you would have gone back to, let's say, 1980, 1990, you could pretty much find that every conservative would have been probably at least not friendly towards gay people, and definitely wouldn't have supported the idea of gay marriage in any way at all. Yet, if we fast forward to today, most Republicans are willing to be silent on the issue, at least, and a lot of them are saying, yeah, it's okay. You know, if gay couples want to get married, that's okay. It's happened. It's there. It is. It's good. In fact, a lot of the conservative circles actually now have gay conservative men prominent in their ranks. Dave Rubin comes to mind. I can think of a few others. But if you look at the libertarians, we never changed. We always said we were inclusive about gay people, that, you know, we weren't for them having any special rights, but they shouldn't be persecuted and they should be left alone by the government, and that if localities wanted to allow some kind of union type thing, marriage like a situation, the Libertarian Party has always been pro on that. It's like, it's not the government's business to determine how this goes. So I think a lot of conservatives, if you took a conservative from today and time traveled him back to, I don't know, say like 1985, and had him meet their younger self and they started talking about what they and their party believed in this day, I think their younger selves would be completely disbelieving that was even possible. Whereas if you did the same thing with a libertarian, for the most part, you would see uh, them saying, "Oh, yeah, of course, that's what a libertarian is. We've always been that way. Uh, our viewpoints on that don't change." Now, yeah, kind of beat up on the conservatives and the Republicans. I'll give the libertarians a little bit of a lashing here, but I think I can put it in, well, let's put a spin on it, I guess is a good way of putting it. Uh, Libertarians do have internal disagreements on certain things, and for the most part, there's an understandable principle involved. Um, Probably one of the biggest issues we've had recently is we did have a big outbreak of wokeism in the party. Uh, there was kind of an idea because we are okay with individuals doing what they want as long as they don't hurt others, but you're allowed to make whatever stupid mistake you want on your own. And the idea is libertarians look at it in terms of the government programs to stop people from doing stupid things usually cause more harm than they do good. It's better to let communities try to fix problem individuals and help them with their problems. However, this actually kind of created what we'd call a libertine wing of the party, where there was almost kind of a celebration of people doing hyper individualistic things. Like instead of just saying, okay, yeah, we're okay with legalizing drugs, this libertine wing would say, no, we celebrate people who are drug addicts. It's like, well, that's not necessarily smart. Well, anyways, this woke branch did dominate the party for about the last maybe 6 to 8 years, and they've been kind of been put under wraps by uh, calmer heads that said, well, no, if you these calmer heads will say, yeah, it's you want to do your trans thing, be trans. You want to be gay, be gay. You want to do drugs. But we're not endorsing it. We're not celebrating it. In fact, we back the idea at the community level. If a community doesn't want that, that they have the ability to try to make the community the way they want. So we more or less agree with each other. We just disagree on how to actually implement the idea. So there is kind of a woke, anti-woke uh, schism in the party currently. The anti-woke are holding all the major power positions in the party. Another area where we do have disputes, and I have a video on this dealing with the idea of whether open borders, are libertarian. And really, the dispute comes down to how do you interpret the idea of how borders work? Do you interpret borders as the world is now, where the government has absolute jurisdiction over the border and things either side of it, and the government has the power to say who can and can't come over the border, versus uh, a Hoppian look at things where uh, government shouldn't be owning land and the border is merely a jurisdictional boundary that doesn't give the government special privileges to give permission or deny permission of people coming over. It's the property owners along that border that have the decision making capacity. And if you look at this divide, uh, there actually isn't a break in principle, it's a break in interpretation of how to view the border with the now versus the future. of how things should look. The other place where we do have issues is abortion. And this falls on a principle as well, where one side looks at it as a life issue, where the unborn human has a right to life. And therefore, that is an area where we should not be encouraging the destruction of life. The other side is looking at essentially the liberty aspect of the woman who has to carry the child. If she is compelled to carry a child in some way, is it a violation of her liberty? And I do see elements of both sides there, and there are ways to come to some form of compromise there, but that's a whole nother video. So those are the prime areas where libertarians have problems in terms of internal disagreements, but the internal disagreements all come from the same principle. So you don't see the same problems that the other parties have, the other sectors of the parties have, because even these core disagreement areas, the three I just mentioned, have been consistently within the libertarian movement from its beginning. They're not things that cropped up along the way and then got adopted in and everyone tried to figure out how to work it. These are issues that had two sides from the very beginning, and both sides trying to figure out how to get the other side reconciled around the principal issue. We're both sides pretty much agreeing that the principle exists. It's just the ultimate application of it being the issue. So ultimately, I would really, obviously I would like to see libertarians succeed. Unfortunately, we're small in number, and realistically, I have to look at what is happening in the conservative movement and the Republican movement. And I really, really hope that this time, if they do end up sweeping government, where they end up with both houses in the presidency and a majority of the state houses, and there is Republican conservative dominance in the country, I really hope they do something good with it. I really want to see them succeed in some ways. But I think this lack of principle will ultimately cause the same problems it always has in the past, where if you have a room full of 100 people and not a single one of them can agree on which branch or which elements of government need to exist and which don't. If you always have a faction that thinks every branch of government's just fine, we don't need to grow it, we just need to grow it slower than it is now, and you have to compromise with people who want to eliminate it, well, the people who want to eliminate things are never going to win. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I wish conservatives well. I wish Republicans well. And in all honesty, I think even on the Democrat side, because I do differentiate between progressives and liberals and regressives, which the Democrats have a big problem with now. I consider progressives the greatest bane the planet has ever seen. However, I strongly empathize with the liberal part of the Democratic Party. I would love to see this shakeup that seems to be coming along. I can't imagine the Democratic Party will be able to stay the same if it takes the beating in the elections that it seems to be about to. It would be great to see the liberals have more prominence over the progressives. So I have good wishes for conservatives, for liberals, and obviously for libertarians as well. I would like to see some form of success from these groups. I just don't see how liberals and conservatives are going to be able to pull it off. Well, thank you for listening. If you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Please like. And if you have comments, go ahead and comment. At least for the time being, I'm trying to answer every comment that's down there. And you have suggestions for future videos, I'll definitely entertain those.